At its peak, the East India Company employed more soldiers than the British government. It taxed a population of 20 million people. It printed its own currency, ran its own courts, and hanged its own criminals. It fought wars across 2 continents, flooded China with enough opium to addict 20 million people, and triggered famines that killed 1 in 3 Bengalis. And when it finally went bankrupt, the British government bailed it out with the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars because the company was, in 1773, too big to fail. This was not a government. This was not a nation. This was a corporation, a private company owned by shareholders in London, run by merchants who had never set foot in the countries they controlled. It is the most powerful corporation in the history of the world, and almost nobody in America knows its name. This is the story of the East India Company. In the year 1599, England was a cold, damp island on the edge of Europe. Its population was about 2.5 million people. It had no permanent navy worth mentioning, no overseas empire, and no real plan to build one. Spain and Portugal had spent the previous century carving up the world between them. The Portuguese controlled the sea routes around Africa to the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. The Dutch had recently muscled in on that trade and were making fortunes selling pepper, nutmeg, and cloves to a Europe that was desperate for them. In London, merchants paid whatever the Dutch asked because they had no alternative. The price of pepper alone had tripled in a decade. On September 24, 1600, 218 London merchants gathered in a small hall near Moorgate. They had watched the Dutch get rich for years, and they wanted in. They pooled their money, raising £68,000, and sent a petition to Queen Elizabeth I asking for permission to trade directly with the East Indies. The Queen, who was always interested in money and always short of it, thought this was an excellent idea. On the last day of that year, December 31st, 1600, she signed the charter. The merchants received a royal grant giving them a monopoly over all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. They called themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London's. Trading into the East Indies, the world would come to know them as the East India Company. This was the birth of something the world had never seen before, the joint stock company in its modern form. Instead of a single wealthy patron funding a voyage, hundreds of investors pooled their capital, shared the risk, and shared the profits. Each investor owned a piece of the enterprise, proportional to what he put in. Each investor could sell his piece to someone else. This was the beginning of the modern stock market. It was also the beginning of the modern corporation. And like so many great innovations in finance, it was invented not to serve society, but to make a small group of already wealthy men significantly wealthier. The genius of the structure was its separation of risk from control. The merchants who sat on the company's board made the decisions: which routes to sail, which ports to target, what prices to demand, which local rulers to bribe, and when to deploy violence. The shareholders who funded those decisions bore the financial risk if things went wrong, but had almost no say in what happened at sea, 6 months from London. It was a structure that concentrated power at the top and distributed consequences to everyone else. Sound familiar? Because this exact model, the shareholder corporation with a professional executive class insulated from accountability, is still how almost every major company in the world is organized today. The East India Company did not invent capitalism, but it did invent the particular flavor of capitalism we currently live inside. The first fleet left England in the spring of 1601. 4 ships, 500 men. At the helm of the flagship, a vessel called the Red Dragon, stood James Lancaster, a veteran privateer who had sailed these waters before. The voyage was a horror. Storms destroyed rigging. Scurvy rotted men's gums until their teeth fell out. Roughly half the crew died before they ever sighted land. When Lancaster finally reached Sumatra, he negotiated a deal with the Sultan of Aceh, loaded his ships with pepper, and turned for home. The Red Dragon limped back into the Thames in September of 1603. The investors got their money back 3 times over, 300% return on their investment in a single voyage. London was hooked. For the next decade and a half, the company sent fleet after fleet east, each one returning with more pepper, more silk, more cotton. The profits were extraordinary. But the company had a problem. The richest markets, the ones that would make real money, were not on the fringes. They were in the interior, in India. And India in 1600 was not some primitive backwater waiting to be exploited. India was the economic center of the world. To understand what the East India Company was walking into, you have to understand the Mughal Empire. In 1615, the most powerful man on earth was not in London or Madrid or Paris. He was in northern India. His name was Jahangir, and he ruled an empire of 150 million people, more than the entire population of Europe combined. His personal income was 100 times that of King James I of England. His court in Agra featured marble pavilions, private zoos, jeweled thrones, and elephants dressed in full battle armor. His treasury held more gold than all the crowned heads of Europe put together. When the King of England sent him gifts, Jahangir sent back a polite thank you note and went back to ruling a quarter of humanity. The company had been operating a small trading post in the western Indian city of Surat for several years, and it was going badly. The local Mughal governor kept raising their taxes. Portuguese ships kept intercepting their vessels. They were tolerated but not respected. The company directors decided they needed something more than merchants. They needed a real diplomat with a letter from a real king. They found their man in Sir Thomas Roe, a member of Parliament and a friend of the Queen. Roe arrived at Jahangir's court in 1615 carrying telescopes, paintings, a golden coach, a pack of English mastiffs, and a case of red wine. He came expecting to meet a colleague. What he found made him feel like a tourist who had wandered into the Vatican. The Mughal court moved with 100,000 people in attendance. There were private libraries, elephant processions, jeweled tributes from every corner of the empire. Roe, representing a country the emperor considered somewhere between Portugal and Ethiopia in importance, spent 4 years kneeling, waiting, and enduring the barely concealed amusement of everyone around him. But he was patient. He watched. He learned. And after 4 long years, he extracted what he had come for: a farman, an imperial trading license that allowed the company to open factories at multiple Indian cities. In his letters home, Roe distilled everything he had learned into one sentence: "You do not fight the Mughals. You do not insult the Mughals. You smile, you wait, you bribe, and you survive at the margins until something changes." The company took that lesson to heart. For the next 60 years, it operated exactly that way: patient, careful, profitable, and entirely dependent on Mughal goodwill. Factories opened in Surat, in Madras, and in a swampy stretch of riverbank in Bengal called Calcutta. The company learned to live in the emperor's shadow, and then, in 1661, the King of England received, as an afterthought on a wedding gift, a piece of real estate that would change everything. King Charles II was on the throne. He was perpetually broke. His father had been beheaded. England had just survived a civil war, a republic, a military dictatorship, and a restoration. The royal treasury was empty. Charles needed money, and he needed allies. He found both in Lisbon. The Portuguese offered their princess, Catherine of Braganza, in marriage. The dowry was impressive: 300,000 pounds in cash, free trade rights with Brazil, the city of Tangier on the North African coast. And almost as an afterthought, one more thing: a small island on India's western coast, perpetually misted with rain, thick with mosquitoes, and largely worthless by any conventional measure. 7 marshy little islands connected at low tide. The Portuguese called it Bombaim. The English called it Bombay. Charles did not want it. His advisors did not want it. The first English garrison sent there lost 2/3 of its men to disease within 3 years. The king decided the island was more trouble than it was worth. In 1668, he transferred it to the East India Company for a rent of £10 per year. It was possibly the most consequential real estate transaction in history. Bombay had something Surat did not have: a deep-water harbor where the largest ships in the world could dock. It was on an island, which meant it could be defended. And most importantly, it was outside Mughal jurisdiction. The company could fortify it. They could mint their own coins there. They could hang their own criminals there. For the first time, the East India Company had a piece of India that was not technically India. They drained the swamps. They built seawalls. They built a fort. They invited Indian merchants to settle under English protection, paying English taxes, governed by English rules. Within 20 years, Bombay's population had grown from 10,000 to 60,000 people. The company had its first city, its first colony in everything but name. And with that, something dangerous began to grow inside the corporation. Not just ambition, but a new kind of ambition: the idea that the company did not have to merely trade in India. It could own India. There was a financial logic to this ambition that the company directors articulated clearly in their internal correspondence. Trading was fine. Trading made money. But taxing was better. A merchant could only earn what he sold. A tax collector could extract a percentage of everything produced by everyone within his territory forever. The company had been watching Mughal provincial governors operate this model for decades. They had paid those governors tribute and fees just to be allowed to operate. The revelation now dawning on the board in London was that they did not have to pay tribute to the tax collector. They could become the tax collector. And in a province as wealthy as Bengal, the mathematical difference between those two positions was almost incomprehensible. In London, a new chairman was taking control of the company in the 1680s. His name was Sir Josiah Child. He had read the reports. He had studied the maps. He had done something no company director had done before. He had calculated whether the Mughal Empire could be beaten. The Emperor Aurangzeb was bogged down in a decades-long war against the Marathas in the south. His armies were stretched. His treasury was bleeding. Child decided the company could take what it wanted by force. In 1686, he sent 19 warships to India with orders to seize Mughal ports until the emperor agreed to better terms. What followed was one of the most embarrassing military disasters in corporate history. The fleet attacked the port of Hooghly in Bengal. They bombarded the city, burned ships, and looted warehouses. For about 3 weeks, everything went well. Then the Mughal response arrived, and it was overwhelming. Mughal armies simultaneously overran every English settlement in India. Surat was taken. Factories were looted. English merchants were arrested across the empire. Bombay itself was besieged. The garrison ran out of food. Disease killed the defenders faster than any battle. What Child had fundamentally failed to understand was the scale of what he was attacking. The Mughal Empire had 150 million people. Its standing army numbered 400,000 men. Its annual revenue was approximately £100 million. The East India Company had perhaps 5,000 men spread across an entire subcontinent. This was not a war. It was a child poking a giant. By 1689, the war was lost. The company sent an embassy to Aurangzeb's camp, not with demands, but with apologies. The directors prostrated themselves. They begged for mercy. Aurangzeb eventually pardoned them in 1690, and the company was allowed to resume trading. They had lost ships, soldiers, money, and reputation. They had learned a lesson they would not forget for 60 years. Against a unified Mughal empire, they had no chance. Then history did something for them that they could never have done for themselves. On February 20th, 1707, a man of 88 years old lay dying in a tent on the dry plateau of the Deccan. His name was Aurangzeb. He had ruled the Mughal Empire for 49 years, spending the last 26 of them chasing Maratha rebels he could never quite catch. He died on March 3rd. The empire died with him. Within a year, his sons were killing each other for the throne. Within 10 years, 3 different Mughal emperors had been crowned and deposed. Within 30 years, the empire that had ruled a quarter of humanity was a shell. The great provincial governors of Bengal, Hyderabad, and Awadh stopped sending tax revenue to Delhi. They built their own armies, minted their own coins, and became kings in everything but name. The Marathas swept northward. The Sikhs rose in Punjab. Persian warlords eyed the frontiers. The roads between cities became dangerous. There was no single moment when the empire fell. It simply unraveled, province by province, governor by governor. By the 1730s, the Mughal emperor was the most magnificently dressed figurehead in the world. He held court in Delhi. Poets composed odes to his glory. But the orders he sent were ignored. The taxes he demanded never arrived. The country Josiah Child had tried to conquer by force had simply dissolved into a collection of competing powers, each one smaller, weaker, and more desperate than the last. And in the wreckage, the East India Company was waiting. In Calcutta, in the late 1740s, a 21-year-old company clerk named Robert Clive was sitting in a small office, staring at ledger books and thinking about suicide. Clive had arrived in Madras in 1744 after a 6-month voyage he spent mostly seasick. He was awkward, irritable, and terrible at small talk. His family had sent him to India because they did not know what else to do with him. India broke him further. The heat, the boredom, the interminable correspondence, the sense that his life was being wasted in a counting house on the other side of the world. In 1745, he wrote to his father saying he had not laughed in 2 years. In a rented room above the company offices, he put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired. He waited a week and tried again. The gun misfired a second time. He put it down and apparently decided, as he would later tell a friend, that he must be reserved for something. History would prove him right, though not in the way most people would choose. Clive volunteered for every dangerous mission. He was promoted. He caught attention. In 1751, he took 200 men and asked permission to attack the strategic fort at Arcot, over 100 miles from the coast. He took it in a single afternoon and held it against a siege of 50 days by 10,000 men. When relief finally arrived, the besiegers had melted away. He was 26 years old. He returned to England a hero, with a fortune, a reputation, and a clear vision of what India could offer a ruthless man. 3 years later, the company sent him back. The Nawab of Bengal, the region's de facto king, was causing problems. But the real power in Bengal in the 1750s was not the Nawab, and it was not the company. It was two cousins sitting in a marble palace in Murshidabad. They were bankers. Their family title was Jagat Seth, which translates with perfect accuracy as Banker of the World. The Jagat Seths were the financial infrastructure of an entire civilization. Their letters of credit were honored from Kabul to Canton. They financed the Mughal court in Delhi. They guaranteed the company's commercial operations in Bengal. They had made and unmade 3 Nawabs in recent memory. The British called them the Rothschilds of India, which was an understatement. The Jagat Seths were richer, older, and more systemically important than any European banking family of the era. Without them, nothing moved in Bengal. Not trade, not tax collection, not government. In April of 1756, the old Nawab died, and his 23-year-old grandson, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, took the throne. Siraj was impulsive, paranoid, and already nursing grievances against the company, which had been expanding its fortifications at Calcutta in violation of his orders. Siraj summoned Mahtab Rai, the head of the Jagat Seth family, to court, and then, in front of the assembled nobility of Bengal, he slapped him across the face. It was the worst mistake of his life. From that moment on, the Jagat Seths began looking for a new partner. They had done this before. They had replaced inconvenient rulers many times. The only question was, who would replace this one, and where the money would come from? The richest bankers in India had just decided to topple the ruler of Bengal. The East India Company was about to receive an offer it could not refuse. In June of 1756, Siraj marched on Calcutta with 50,000 men. The company governor, Roger Drake, panicked, boarded a ship on the river, and abandoned the city. Most senior officers followed him. The defense collapsed in 3 days. Fort William fell on June 20th. That night, English prisoners, soldiers, clerks, and a few women were packed into a small punishment cell in the fort. The room was 18 feet by 14 feet. It had 2 small windows. They were left there until morning. When the survivors were counted, the English would claim that 146 people had entered and 23 had walked out. The Black Hole of Calcutta became the most famous atrocity story in all of British imperial history, taught to British school children for the next 200 years. Whether the cell killed 123 people or 30, the story had the same effect. It gave the East India Company permission to retaliate. It gave them, for the first time, a moral justification that their own public could support. In January of 1757, Robert Clive retook Calcutta in a single afternoon with 2,000 sepoy soldiers and 900 British troops. Siraj signed a peace treaty. Clive did not believe it would hold. Neither did anyone else in the room. By June, both sides were marching toward war. On June 23, 1757, Clive's 3,000 men faced Siraj's 50,000 on a muddy mango grove along the Bhagirathi River, near a small village called Plassey. Siraj had cavalry, 300 war elephants in full armor, 50 heavy cannon operated by French artillerists, and a 10-to-1 numerical advantage. By every conventional measure of 18th century warfare, the battle should have been over in an hour. But Siraj did not know that the battle was already lost. For weeks, a conspiracy had been forming, not with swords, but with silver. The Jagat Seths had reached out directly to Siraj's own commanding general, a man named Mir Jafar, and offered him the throne of Bengal in exchange for betraying his master. The company would get the treasury. The bankers would get a ruler who owed them everything. It was a coup disguised as a battle. When the fighting began that June morning, elephants charged, cannons roared, and Clive held his line. He waited. Then nothing happened. Mir Jafar's division stood perfectly still in the field. Orders were sent to them and ignored. Siraj's ranks began to dissolve as the confusion spread through his troops like fire through dry grass. The most powerful army in eastern India collapsed not from enemy assault, but from the silent betrayal in its own ranks. Siraj fled on a fast camel. 3 days later he was captured on a riverbank, disguised as a beggar eating rice from a pilgrim's bowl. He was brought back in chains to the palace where he had been crowned 15 months earlier. That night, in a corridor of his own court, he was murdered by the son of a man he had once executed. He was 24 years old. His grandfather had warned him on his deathbed to be careful of the Europeans. He had not listened. With that silent act of betrayal, the East India Company slid from merchant to monarch. It is worth pausing here to understand what Plassey actually was, because the version taught in most history classes sanitizes it almost beyond recognition. Plassey was not a military victory. It was a financial transaction that happened to involve a battle as cover. The Jagat Seth bankers had identified a political outcome they desired, located the military asset willing to deliver it, priced the transaction in silver, and executed it on schedule. The company provided the battlefield legitimacy. The bankers provided the capital and the inside man. Mir Jafar provided the army that stood still at the right moment. Siraj-ud-Dowlah never had a chance, not because he was outfought, but because the people he trusted to fight for him had already been bought. The battle lasted a few hours. The negotiation that preceded it took months. Plassey was not won with cannons. It was won with accounting. On June 29, 1757, Robert Clive walked into the treasury at Murshidabad. He was 28 years old. He stood inside a vault containing more silver and gold than the Bank of England held. He was allowed to take what he wanted. He took £234,000 for himself personally. He arranged a private property grant in Bengal worth £27,000 per year. Other company executives followed his example. Within months, they were sending fortunes home in sealed trunks stamped with the company coat of arms. The English language gained a new word that year. The Hindustani term for plunder and pillage was luta. Before 1757, the word loot did not exist in English. After 1757, you could not open a London newspaper without seeing it. The men coming home from Bengal were called nabobs, a mangled version of the Mughal title Nawab. They built country estates. They bought seats in Parliament. They were the first generation of self-made multimillionaires in British history, and every penny of it came from Bengal. Mir Jafar sat on the throne but ruled nothing. The company commanded the army. The company set tax rates. The company decided which goods crossed which borders without paying duties. The puppet signed whatever he was told to sign. In August of 1765, Clive returned to India for his third and final posting. He met the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam at Allahabad, and, on a simple table inside a tent, the emperor signed a single document called the Diwani. It granted the company the legal right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. 20 million people, £3 million per year. According to a Mughal historian who witnessed the transaction, the entire proceeding took less time than it would have taken to sell a donkey. The Diwani was the moment the East India Company stopped being a corporation in any sense we would recognize. They had just become the legal tax authority for the richest provinces on earth. They were a private company managing a country, running courts, minting currency, commanding armies, and sending the profits back to shareholders in London. They called it administration. It was extraction. The extraction began in earnest. Company officials sent their fortunes home in sealed trunks. Provincial administrators imposed new fees, new tariffs, new barriers. The Jagat Seth bankers, who had engineered the whole transition, found themselves systematically marginalized. The company did not need partners anymore. When Mir Jafar tried to resist the new arrangement, the company replaced him with his son-in-law. When that son-in-law grew too assertive, they replaced him too. The throne of Bengal became a revolving door of puppets. Then the rain stopped. In a normal year, the Bengali monsoon provides the water that makes Bengal the most agriculturally productive province on earth. In 1768, the rains were weak. In 1769, there were almost no rains at all. The rice harvest failed. The price of grain in Calcutta doubled in 3 months. By the spring of 1770, it had increased tenfold. People were selling their tools, then their livestock, then their children, just to eat. The company did not stop collecting taxes. In the districts hit hardest by the famine, the tax demand was actually increased by 10% to compensate for the shortfall. Company soldiers were sent into villages with empty carts to force collection from farmers who had nothing left. Families who had survived by selling everything they owned began to die in the spring of 1769. The dying accelerated through the summer of 1770. Bodies piled up on the roads outside Murshidabad and Patna. The Hooghly River ran slow with corpses. When the monsoon finally returned in September of 1770, somewhere between 7 and 10 million Bengalis were dead, 1 in every 3 people in the province. Bengal had lost more of its population in a single famine than the Black Death had taken from England. In London, the company paid its shareholders a 12.5% dividend. The directors knew. The reports were on their desks. They received regular dispatches from Bengal describing the state of the harvest, the price of grain, the mortality rates in district after district. They were not ignorant of what was happening. They made a calculation, the same calculation that businesses make every quarter. The short-term cost of humanitarian relief was higher than the short-term cost of maintaining the existing extraction schedule. So they kept collecting, and 10 million people died. The famine of 1770 was not a natural disaster. The drought was natural. The famine was a policy outcome. The company had spent 12 years stripping Bengal of every form of economic resilience, the grain reserves, the local credit networks, the village welfare systems, the mechanisms that pre-modern societies built over centuries to survive exactly this kind of shock. When the rains failed, there was nothing left to absorb the impact, and the company's response was to accelerate extraction during the worst of it. You should also know what happened to the Jagat Seth bankers, the men who had engineered everything. After Plassey, the company had no more use for them. The new Nawabs the company installed had no reason to honor the bankers' historical privileges. Within 2 decades, the Jagat Seth family, which had for a century been the most powerful financial institution in Asia, was stripped of its influence, its properties progressively absorbed, its credit networks dismantled. The company did not just eat Bengal, it ate the people who had helped it get there. There was no loyalty in the transaction. There never is. By 1772, the famine had destroyed Bengal's tax base. The dividends were being paid out of capital. The stock price was being sustained by lies. In June of 1772, a Scottish banker named Alexander Fordyce disappeared from his London office, leaving debts of £550,000. His bank failed the next morning. Within 3 weeks, 30 banks across Britain and Europe had collapsed in a cascade. The company's chairman was personally bankrupt. The stock was in freefall. The directors went to the Bank of England asking for a loan of £400,000. The bank refused. By August, the company was quietly telling the government that it needed £1 million more, or it would collapse and take the City of London with it. Sound familiar? In 1773, Parliament passed the bailout, £1.4 million to save a company whose executives had just looted the richest province in Asia, while millions of its inhabitants starved. It was the first bailout in modern history, too big to fail, 170 years before the phrase existed. The same playbook, a vanishing banker, a cascade of 30 bank failures, a personally bankrupt executive, a corporation too systemically important to be allowed to collapse, a government rescue. The only difference between 1773 and 2008 is the name of the bank. Robert Clive was called before Parliament to testify. General Burgoyne called him a common sheep stealer. Clive defended himself in a speech still remembered today, recalling the treasuries of Bengal, describing what he could have taken and chose not to take, and telling the chamber that he was, in that moment, astonished at his own moderation. He was acquitted. He returned to his house in Berkeley Square. The gout worsened, the opium doses increased. On November 26, 1774, in the bathroom of his London home, the man who delivered India to Britain cut his own throat with a penknife. He was 49 years old. He is buried in an unmarked grave in the village church where he was baptized. The system he built outlasted him by a century. In Calcutta, a different kind of man had taken charge. Warren Hastings, 42 years old, who had lived in India most of his adult life, spoke Bengali and Persian fluently, and had said more than once that he loved India slightly more than his own country. He believed the company could be reformed. He was wrong, but he tried. What Hastings looked at when he examined the books was a simple and brutal reality. The famine had destroyed Bengal's agricultural tax base, the textile trade was not enough, and the company needed a new revenue source. He found it in the poppy fields of Bihar. In 1773, Hastings established a company monopoly on Bengali opium. Factories rose in Patna and Ghazipur. Farmers who had grown rice were compelled to grow poppies. The opium was processed, packed into mango wood chests, and shipped down the Ganges to Calcutta. From Calcutta, private traders smuggled it to China. By the 1780s, the East India Company was the largest narcotics trafficking operation in human history. This solved a problem the British had struggled with for 2 centuries. Britain wanted Chinese tea. China wanted nothing from Britain except silver. For 200 years, silver had been flowing east, draining British coffers. Opium reversed that flow. By 1820, silver was moving in the opposite direction, from China to Calcutta and then to London. The company had just inverted the global financial system using drug money. As the opium trade grew, military conquest accelerated across India. By 1818, the entire subcontinent was under company control. Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, had been killed in his own capital. The Marathas had been broken in battle. The emperor in Delhi, now blind and ruling nothing, sat under a tattered canopy in the Red Fort. Meanwhile, in England, the steam engine arrived. The mills of Lancashire began producing cotton cloth at a cost lower than Bengali hand weavers could match. The company stopped importing Indian textiles. It started exporting British ones. The weavers of Bengal, the men who had once produced the muslin that clothed the courts of Europe, began dying by the thousands. The Governor-General wrote home that the bones of the cotton weavers were bleaching the plains of India. To understand what the opium trade actually meant in human terms, consider the numbers. In 1820, roughly 1 million Chinese people were addicted to opium. By 1838, the year before Lin Zexu arrived in Canton, that number had grown to between 2 and 12 million, depending on which estimate you use. Whole provinces were being hollowed out. Officials were addicted. Soldiers were addicted. The people who were supposed to enforce the emperor's laws were buying opium from the same ships they were supposed to stop. The silver drainage was catastrophic. China was losing somewhere between 30 and 40 million silver dollars per year to opium imports by the late 1830s. The Qing dynasty, one of the most powerful states on earth, was being financially bled by a commodity that a private British company was growing in India and shipping across the sea. This was not trade. This was state capture through narcotics. In China, the opium chests were stacking up. The Daoguang Emperor was counting his addicts. He was counting the silver leaving his treasury. In March of 1839, he sent a commissioner named Lin Zexu to Canton with orders to end the trade. Lin surrounded the foreign warehouses with troops, cut off food and water, and demanded that the British surrender every opium chest in the port. 20,000 chests, over 1,200 tons, approximately 2 million pounds sterling in value. The British refused, then submitted. Lin ordered the chests dissolved in seawater and lime. The destruction took 23 days. Britain went to war over it. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, was the most honest act of imperial aggression in history. The British government deployed its navy to force China to continue buying drugs grown in India by a private company. William Gladstone, who would later become Prime Minister, called it a war more unjust in its origins than any war in which we had ever been engaged. Steam frigates against wooden junks. The Chinese fleet was destroyed. Coastal cities were bombarded. The Treaty of Nanjing forced China to pay an indemnity of $21 million, open 5 ports to British trade, and cede Hong Kong to the British Crown. The opium trade tripled. A second war in 1856 resulted in the burning of the Summer Palace in Beijing. 300 years of imperial Chinese art reduced to ash in 2 days, and the legalization of opium throughout China. The opium trade transformed 2 continents. India grew the drug. China consumed it. Britain extracted the profits and used them to fund the largest empire in human history. Without opium revenue, the British Empire in Asia simply could not pay for itself. The company had built a global narcotics economy, and millions of people on both ends of it would spend generations paying the price. The Opium Wars are one of the most clarifying episodes in the history of capitalism, precisely because they are so honest. Usually, the story that gets told about colonial expansion involves civilization, Christianity, or progress. With the Opium Wars, there is no story to tell except the one the British told themselves internally. We need the revenue. The Chinese won't buy anything else willingly, so we will force them at gunpoint to continue buying the drug. Gladstone was not wrong, and Parliament voted for it anyway, because the company's finances, and by extension, the British Empire's finances, depended on it. Back in India, something was stirring in the company's own army. By 1857, the East India Company had the largest standing army in Asia. 250,000 sepoys, Indian soldiers trained in European tactics, armed with European weapons, commanded by British officers. 20 Indians for every 1 Briton. The men were underpaid. The British officers despised them. They were sent to fight wars in Burma, in Afghanistan, in the Punjab, wars that had nothing to do with India. Their pensions were docked, their religious practices were mocked, and then, in January of 1857, a new rifle arrived at their barracks. The Enfield rifle was more accurate and more powerful than anything the sepoys had used before. Its cartridges were lubricated with animal fat. To load the rifle, the sepoy had to bite the cartridge to open it. The rumor spread through the barracks within weeks. The grease was from cows. The grease was from pigs. Sacred to Hindus, forbidden to Muslims, the same cartridge desecrated both faiths in a single bite. In May of 1857, the sepoys of the garrison city of Meerut refused the cartridges. They were shackled and marched to prison in front of the entire garrison. The next afternoon, their comrades rose. Barracks burned. British officers were killed. By nightfall, the rebels were riding south toward Delhi. The uprising spread like fire through dry grass across northern India. Delhi fell. Lucknow was besieged. The 82-year-old Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, great-grandson of Aurangzeb, was proclaimed leader of the rebellion. Princes, landowners, and religious leaders joined the cause. For 6 months, the East India Company lost control of every major city in northern India. This was not a mutiny. This was a mass uprising against 2.5 centuries of extraction. For the first time since Plassey, the company faced not a king or a governor, but the people themselves. And the people had weapons, training, and a century of grievances. London responded with the largest military mobilization in imperial history. Tens of thousands of British regular soldiers were transported by sea and rail. Superior artillery, superior coordination, brutal reprisals. Cities were shelled, villages were burned, rebels were hanged, shot, or tied to the muzzles of cannons and blown apart. The rebellion was crushed by the summer of 1858, but the cost of victory was the destruction of every illusion the company had ever maintained about itself. The pretense of partnership, of administration, of legitimate rule was gone. Parliament could no longer pretend this was a trading company providing a public service. On August 2, 1858, Queen Victoria signed the Government of India Act. The East India Company was formally dissolved. All its territories, all its armies, all its treaties, all its debts were absorbed whole by the British Crown. The most powerful corporation that had ever existed on earth died not in battle but with a signature on a piece of paper. The company directors retired to London with handshakes and small ceremonies. Its sepoys became the new British Indian Army. Its civil servants became crown servants. Its courts became crown courts. Its taxes became crown taxes. The company itself quietly went out of business in 1874, with less ceremony than the bankruptcy of a regional railroad. There was no funeral. There was no monument. There was no reckoning. What replaced it was the British Raj, more bureaucratic, more direct, more systematically organized, but built on exactly the same foundation the company had constructed over 2.5 centuries. The same tax machinery, the same opium factories, the same racial hierarchies, the same military apparatus, the railway network built not to connect India, but to move troops, the telegraph installed not to serve Indians, but to carry orders, the administrative structure designed not to govern for the benefit of the governed, but to extract the maximum possible value from a captive population and ship it home. In the decades of the Raj that followed, India would lose somewhere between 100 and 200 million people to famine, as London refused to authorize relief shipments while the empire continued exporting Indian grain to Britain. The traditional textile industries of Bengal were deliberately dismantled. The economy was locked into producing raw materials for British factories. An entire civilization was rewired to serve the needs of a small island 9,000 miles away. The East India Company itself is almost entirely absent from American history education. But it should not be, because the East India Company invented almost everything that defines how power and money interact in the modern world: the joint stock corporation, the shareholder dividend, the board of directors, the government bailout of a too-big-to-fail financial institution, the use of a monopoly to suppress wages and competition, the legal separation between the people who make decisions and the people who pay the consequences, the idea that private enterprise can govern a population more efficiently than a democratic government, and that this efficiency justifies the arrangement. None of these ideas died in 1858. They changed uniforms. The company's structure became the template for every multinational corporation that followed it. The arguments it made to Parliament, that free trade benefits everyone, that regulation stifles innovation, that a corporation's primary duty is to its shareholders, those arguments are still being made today in boardrooms and in Congress by people who have likely never heard of Robert Clive or the Diwani or the Bengal famine. What died in 1858 was the specific fiction that a private corporation could govern a captive population indefinitely without provoking a violent response. The Sepoy Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, depending on your perspective, demonstrated the limits of purely extractive rule. You could run a population through a corporation for about a century before the people whose lives you were extracting decided they had nothing left to lose. The British learned the lesson and shifted from corporate administration to direct imperial administration. The machinery stayed the same. The ownership changed hands. The extraction continued. There is one final number worth holding in your mind. Economic historians estimate that between 1765 and 1938, Britain extracted from India the equivalent of approximately $45 trillion in today's value. That transfer of wealth from one of the richest regions on Earth to a small island nation is the reason India is a developing economy today, and Britain is not. It is the largest theft in human history. It was not committed by pirates or warlords. It was committed by a corporation with shareholders, a board of directors, a stock price, and a government bailout when things went wrong. Too big to fail, too profitable to stop, too powerful to hold accountable. Sound familiar?